as Jen said, I'm Katie. I'm going to be talking to you about Ember Observer scores. Very quickly, I'm from Codal Day, a small consultancy around we specialize in Ember. This is Ember Observer. You've heard a lot about it this conference. It's been a lot of presentations. I'm very proud of that. We aim to help users find open source Ember add-ons to use and learn from. It's been 4 years since I started Ember Observer, and a lot has been added and a lot has changed. But something stayed exactly the same until very recently is the scoring process. So you may have seen me use this slide in a previous talk. This is the list of the criteria or representations of the criteria I use to score the add-ons. But this was a fixed list, so literally when you said has tests, you got 1 point and 1 plus 1 for running those tests and 1 for documentation, and eventually it added up to 10. And there were 10 checks. And this wasn't very flexible, though. So I'd be asked, can you score on accessibility? And I'd have to say no. And I'd be asked, can you encourage changelog updates through the score? And I'd have to say no. And I'd be asked, can you score on whether add-ons are Octane ready? And I'd say no. And so I decided to finally do something about this. I always intended to years ago. And so I turned to something we'd all swore we wouldn't need as adults. I got to some math. And I was certain that I knew enough math, but I wanted to make sure, so I reached out to some friends of mine that actually do math day to day to make sure that I do something that actually makes sense and I'm not just, pulling it out of my ass. So I ended up just settling on a weighted average for the scores. This may be the first thought. I had some constraints. I wanted to be able to use various components of the checks to count more or less than each of them, so that's the weighted part. I wanted to make sure I could have some checks that apply to some, but not all add-ons. And I wanted to make sure the scores could be compared across add-ons. So I didn't want to have an individual score that'd be great in the context of one add-on, but you couldn't have a competition between add-ons. So for example, those has tests, so I put this here, the math in programmer speak. I'm not going to go through it now because I'm a very quick 5-minute math lesson might be a little tough. So each check kind of has a value, end result value, and it gets weighted. And then for each check, we can gather the weighted value, sum that, and divide by the sum of the weights. Then we multiply by 10 to scale it. So the really easy example is a 1. And if you get full points on all checks, and you'll end up with a 10. So before I change anything, I looked at the distribution of add-ons across scores. And you want to notice that the lowest score is a 2, and that's because 2 points were free. They were originally checks that made sense, but over time I replaced them by marking add-ons as work in progress or not listing them at all on the site for things that are closed source. So the first step is to rebalance the scores from the 0 to 10 range. So after doing that, I get a very similar looking chart, but everything's scooted over a little to the left to 0. And all the checks were now effectively 1/8 of the score, since they're all equally weighted. Now that was done, I had all the power. The scoring is extensible, testable, and easy to change, so I began an exploration of what I can do. The first thing I looked at was weighting. I finally had the ability to change the importance of parts of the scores. 2 points representing the popularity were now 1/4 of the score, and I didn't think that felt right. So I have the weight of both of those, and the end result is this chart of the different checks. I'm going to go back to experimenting with reweighting some of the checks that are still there, but I wanted to further experiment with other types of changes first. I was able to change some of the existing checks to be more sophisticated to give partial credit. For example, now you can get, as you have more GitHub contributors, you get more credit towards a current thing, and I went with the average of GitHub contributors for full credit, which is 5. I added some new checks, and this is the real fun part. So I explored adding a check for the non-default description. It's very lightly weighted. I just wanted to encourage add-ons to update that. Added a check for having more than one maintainer on NPM to ensure an add-on didn't have a bus factor of 1 for publishing. And I added a lightly weighted check for being at least 1.0. This is the beginning of new score components. The other most important part about this is to surface the new score components to the users and add-on developers. So this is what you'll see on the Ember Observer site now when you go there and you go to explain on a score. You'll see all the checks that made up that particular score and what they contributed to the final result. Not all these checks are live yet, but they will be very soon, and I'll include a write-up of how they work. This unlocks a lot of storing changes I'd like to make, including the questions that were asked earlier in this talk. And that's all I have. Thank you.